Hey folks, appreciate you watching today. When we started July, obviously we saw the catastrophic Texas Hill Country floods that was followed up later in the holiday weekend with additional flash flooding across portions of the southern U.S. And I think I mentioned even that following Tuesday that unfortunately we were probably likely to see additional flash flooding events. And Eric and I talk about this often, that the persistence in the atmosphere tends to win the day. And so when the atmosphere presents kind of a tendency to do something, we think of that as likely to occur again, whether it's troughing over the central part of the country or these flash flooding events. And so I mentioned almost less about an exact reason for the flooding, that just the likelihood of it continuing over the next week or so was a concern. I think I mentioned we were likely to see more of that, without even pointing to any particular meteorological factors, if you will. And unfortunately, over the next roughly 7 days, here it is Tuesday, a week later, we've seen additional flash flooding across the continental U.S. as a result. And I think part of what we're seeing here, Eric highlighted this yesterday, was one, all of the moisture that has been pumping into the central part of the country. We've seen very strong, whatever you want to call it, anomalously juiced Bermuda high, which has just pumped Gulf moisture up into the central part of the country repetitively. We've also seen generally, and if you just look at the infrared satellite on the continental U.S. here this morning, I think this highlights it. To the north, here's the Canadian border up here. We see these storms here by the infrared returns. We've seen plenty of flow in this direction. In fact, we've seen plenty of troughs and ridges, kind of the waves coming through. And when we show the temperature maps, they're warming up Tuesday, Wednesday. They cool down by the weekend, and then it's just on and on and on. But to the south, over this kind of corridor here, we've seen a total lack of flow. And the Bermuda high has been pumping moisture in, and it's been just careening into some of the fronts in this area. And we've had just thunderstorms parked over one area long enough that we've seen pretty ridiculous rainfall values, whether it was the hill country floods in Texas. We saw additional rainfall here over the last 48 hours. Just yesterday, New York City saw footage of flooding in the subway system. And then Chicago, roughly a week ago, where they had 5 or 6 inches of rain, near downtown Chicago in a brief period of time. So the atmosphere has presented that tendency to rain a lot over one area with, high flash flooding concerns. And we have to respect that. That continues, I think, here this week. We'll talk about that in a minute. One thing I will want to point out that I am looking at here on the infrared satellite imagery, just beyond the storms that we can see here near the Canadian border. And look at this burgeoning potential tropical system here near Florida. I sound like a broken record. How often have we mentioned kind of these cutoff lows down here? And here's another one, this potential tropical system. We'll take a look at this in a second. The National Hurricane Center eyeing that this morning. If we look over the last 24 hours of rainfall, again, it's hard to see, right, with this relatively small screen. This is radar-derived estimates of yesterday's rainfall, essentially. But if I zoom in a little bit, you can see the storms tracking across the border here near Canada, some through the Dakotas, South Dakota. Saw some severe wind reports in here in the west central part of the state, including some severe reports here all the way down into east central Colorado, east of the Front Range. But you can just generally see the different regimes, if you will, that the atmosphere has set up. One, the rainfall coming through here is more like looking for the word swathy, right? These like swaths of rain moving west to east along the flow that we've been seen so prevalently at the end of June into July here. And in the southern portion of the country, this kind of less swathy, more splotchy, right? Different S word. And then just rain sitting over one area. Here in the Big Bend area of Texas, you can see tremendous rainfall amounts here in the southwest portion of the state. And then over in the eastern U.S., New York, it's going to be hard to see because there's so many borders right at the confluence of New York, Connecticut, Long Island, Manhattan, and New Jersey here. But there are some significant rainfall values in here as well, prompting some of the flooding concerns. So this activity likely to continue today. We have some flood watches out we'll look at in a minute. And then Florida with that upper level low and that potential tropical system trying to grow underneath it. You can see all the rainfall there as well. National Hurricane Center has eyed that area now. If we look at their latest outlook, this is their 7-day outlook, a 40% chance of cyclone formation. And the system is expected to move rather quickly across the peninsula itself and then jut out into the Gulf of America here. And we'll see if it can get its act together. But the problem that it's dealing with now, and they'll probably mention this in some of the discussion that's up on the screen, which I don't expect you to read, frankly, because it's so small. But it's dealing with some wind shear here this morning, and then it's just doesn't have a lot of time, right? When you're this close to the coastline versus, 10, 14 days out over the middle of the ocean, you just don't have a lot of time to develop before you run over the land and lose that critical moisture connection. One thing we have seen too over the last, I'll call it a week or so, is the wildfire concern, at least in the U.S. proper, south of the Canadian border, where we've seen a fast season start. You can see all the incidents up here. But the west, we've seen wildfires in California, the Madre fire down in south central portion of the state. Further to the north, I think the Green fire up here near the Shasta National Forest. And then Utah saw some incredible footage. If you can look it up, please do, of a fire whirl, a fire tornado. And this maybe over here in Utah, just kind of incredible footage of one of these kind of fire-induced tornadoes, which frankly we do not know too much about, but they can be, near to EF3 strength. And when you consider that they're also on fire, it doesn't sound like a good combination. I saw some footage of that come in over the last kind of 48 hours or so. If we jump over and look at the all hazards map, this is valid about 6 a.m. Central Time. See if we can update this. There, go closer to 6:30. You see the green here? These are all separate flood watches here. So I can see 5 areas of flood watch concern. One, we have those thunderstorms moving through Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, touched on those. Over here in the mid-Atlantic, Virginia, parts of North Carolina, through the Delmarva Peninsula. We talked about the flooding concerns in New York yesterday. So with all that moisture just streaming into this area, continuing to see all the way over here near Arkansas and Oklahoma, down here in southwestern Texas, right? We've talked about the hill country floods, and we saw activity further to the southwest, thankfully not, right over the same area. That's continuing. And then over here in Arizona, we talked this year, the expectation for, a more typical or even more active monsoon. We've seen that at times. There's been lulls, but it's had, more often than not, some activity moving through the Four Corners region. We also see some heat advisories sneaking up here around the Twin Cities, here through the lower Mississippi River Valley, along the Florida Panhandle, over toward North New England. But if you look west, you can see much more of that. The heat advisories running up the Willamette Valley into the Seattle-Tacoma area, San Joaquin Valley, and then the red flag warnings again. Eastern Idaho, far southern Montana, into Nevada, Utah as well. So the wildfire concern, I think this summer, unfortunately continuing until we see some of a break. And the ridging that we've seen out west, I think that's likely to come at the long range. We'll talk about that at the last few slides of this video. But with the heat building out west, rather cooler middle part of the country, there is this kind of common yin-yang in the atmosphere where when the west is warm, the central part of the country stays cooler. More often than not, that's the pattern that's going to set up. Look at the 500 millibar winds just this morning, get an idea of where the jet stream is. There's that ridge. I talked about the kind of ridging across the western U.S., fueling those wildfires. It's off the coast of British Columbia here. And this is going to become an important dance for much of the continental U.S. over the kind of 10 to 14-day forecast. This ridge is amplifying. You can kind of see it strengthening almost now with this low trough just to the west of it. And it's what we're going to see, and I'll kind of spoil the long-range forecast in a bit, is this ridge start to amplify so much and move a little bit off to the west. It's going to allow some of the troughing that has been positioned here. We can see a rather deep trough here over Canada. That's going to be pushing through over the forecast period. If it starts to inch to the west, it's going to allow ridging to build back in over kind of the middle or eastern part of the country. Let's call it kind of the central east corridor here. We talked about a Nashville high previously in June. That allowed heat to build into the Midwest at the end of June in a big way. But we're going to be watching this ridge here because right now it's played along such to keep this part of the country cooler. As it starts to strengthen an inch west, that story likely to change, kind of maybe at the end of next week. If we look at the radar here this morning, we were looking at the infrared earlier. Again, those storms over portions of the Dakotas, Montana, through Minnesota. Seeing some rainfall come in here with that trough off over Canada. If you look closer here, we talked about the flooding potential in Arkansas, some of the flood watches there, southwest Texas, all the rainfall there overnight. And in the mid-Atlantic, kind of seeing a lull in the precipitation here in the early morning hours. But my eye was immediately caught again to this area of low pressure, this disturbance that the National Hurricane Center is keeping their eye on all the way down here in Florida. And so, of course, I had to zoom in on that, get a closer look. Can see this little spin up here. It looks tropical in nature. There's certainly no kind of jet stream level flow producing this low level spin here. So kind of a neat little tropical spin up, unlikely to be named. In fact, kind of went over how to scrutinize it further, right? So go look at the surface observations. I'm going to go through these quickly because they're kind of hard to read on a small screen. But what these wind barbs show us here is that the east coast of Florida, you have winds out of the west-northwest, and to the north of that system, you can see the winds trying to maybe curl around a little bit here very weakly. These are only down at 5 knots. So, this isn't a tropical storm or anything, but is kind of one of these little weak spin-ups that's occurring here. And with some of the thunderstorm and the shower activity, shows you why the National Hurricane Center has eyed this area here. Also, if you look here at the coast of Florida, do you see these little rings that are even here in southwest? Do you see the rings that are shooting off some of these forested areas here? Those are birds. Probably here I'm recording this about 6 a.m. That's about 7 a.m. Eastern time. My guess is there's some sort of like tropical bird down here that leaves the roost at sunrise. That would have been right at sunrise here. We often see these with bats or other birds in the central part of the country at dusk. But it's kind of cool to see these in the morning here. That's all what those returns are. If we jump over and look at the 500 millibar height anomaly from the ECMWF, trying to eye that trough that we were looking at in the 500 millibar winds just a bit ago on the analysis. And you can see it here over Manitoba roughly, and I have little shortwave sneaking one through Montana here. We saw some of that precip coverage unfolding over Montana. And then there's that little cutoff that we're watching here near Florida, almost kind of right over, funny enough, that spin that we were watching. We do see some ridging here that's built into the eastern part of the country, so a little bit warmer here today, but with this trough moving through quickly, once I start playing this forward, you're going to see this bringing it into the heat that's trying to build in here. We saw a little bit yesterday and today, and I'll take this forecast through today into tonight. You see this troughing moving in through the central plains, pushing through the east. You can see that ridge trying to re-intensify here on Wednesday and then Thursday over the eastern part of the country, still seeing some troughing over Canada. And then watching this ridge here, keep a close eye on this as we go through the forecast period, this ridge south of Alaska, west of British Columbia. So take us into this weekend. What was that little kind of cutoff low here, potential tropical system? It has migrated into the Gulf and then made, I'm going to call it landfall, although it's unlikely, at least right now, to be a tropical system. It is something we'll have to watch as we get closer toward this weekend. Generally some weak ridging, some upper level height anomalies here over the eastern part of the country. Let's go through the week. We'll look at those temperatures. As we get on to next week, additional troughing out west. You can see that near Idaho, Washington, Montana, Monday, Tuesday. And this is the pattern that I was kind of asking us to keep a close eye on. We got to watch what I'll call at this point an Alaskan ridge. As that amplifies, you'll notice that when I started this video, it maybe had a orientation like that allowed that troughing to come through the middle part of the country. But as it gets more amplified, as that flow goes all the way up almost north of Alaska here, following those contours, it allows that troughing to dig further and further back toward their west. And again, it's just kind of this wave pattern through the atmosphere, right? So that's allowing this ridge to build back in here over the Midwest as we get out toward next week. This is now July 23rd. This is the ECMWF, and you can see that ridge, it just gets entrenched right over St. Louis. I called it a Nashville ridge earlier in June, but might be looking late next week. This all the way out to the 25th. As that ridging amplifies over Alaska, we get troughing underneath that. Eric talked about this potential for a blocking pattern over the eastern Pacific, allowing some of this ridging to build back into the middle part of the country. So that heat risk is returning. Now, there is some pieces to this forecast that are critical. One, as that ridge builds in, even looking out, Tuesday, Wednesday of next week, we still have some troughing over, even the Dakotas here, over Montana, over Wyoming. This is a pattern that's very conducive for some of these ridge riding, almost derecho severe weather events through the northern tier of the Midwest. I'll kind of draw this corridor here, and we're seeing that show up in some of the precipitation anomalies. So it isn't the driest forecast yet for some of these high production regions that, keeping a close eye on here in July, certainly tasseling in a wide area now across this part, but it would be a warmer forecast with potentially some warmer nights depending on that precipitation coverage. Let's just jump over and look at them rather than talk about it on the iPad. Let's look at that precipitation forecast. I'm going to take this forecast quickly here through this evening. Into tonight, you can see storm coverage, showers as well, increasing in coverage through southern Minnesota, the eastern Dakotas, and Nebraska. See additional precipitation over Montana, some of these areas in need of that rain, the western Dakotas as well. As I play this forecast forward into Wednesday evening, you can see that, again, the activity shifting east over Wisconsin, portions of Illinois, and the eastern Corn Belt. There's that tropical system over the next 48 hours migrating from what's now maybe the east coast of Florida on the Atlantic coastline, pushing west out into the Gulf, failing to organize, at least on this ECMWF forecast, but definitely a coherent, I'm going to call it a blob of tropical moisture and rainfall, likely to be making something called we'll call it a landfall for now as we get closer toward Thursday and Friday. We do see a low pressure system trying to spin up here at the Great Lakes Wednesday evening. That pushes off into New England, leaving one of these fronts kind of draped behind it on Friday. Could see some showers associated with that. But then this weekend, see another one of these troughs coming through. Look here at the Central Plains through Minnesota, additional precipitation, moving through portions of Illinois, the Central Corn Belt into the Eastern Corn Belt on Saturday. Additional weak troughing here over Monday. And we set up another one of these trains here. I'm going to flip this forecast back to the 0Z to allow us to get out into next week. And that's when we saw, remember next week around the 23rd, when we saw that ridging start to build into the middle part of the country. But with that troughing over here in the Canadian Prairie, Montana, we see precipitation coverage increase there. And there's one of these, you can almost see it from the ECMWF. Do you see how quickly this precipitation streak moves from Wisconsin into Michigan and then over here toward Lake Erie in Pennsylvania. That is the ECMWF model resolving one of these derecho-like events, or at least attempting to. You can see that make its way all the way to the Atlantic. I can just tell, seen enough of these, you can see this little low pressure system. That's very indicative of the ECMWF model here, catching onto one of these. I'm not going to call it a derecho proper as if it's a forecast, more than a week out, but it does highlight the potential for this corridor here in the middle part of next week. I would think the chances that we see some sort of wind event, intense thunderstorm through this corridor here is going to be increased in the middle part of next week with this pattern unfolding the way it is. When all said and done, here is what the WPC, their 7-day precipitation forecast, looks like. Again, immediately clear where that potential tropical system trying to make landfall here somewhere in Louisiana. Whether it reaches tropical storm strength or not is kind of semantics in terms of some low sustained wind. Don't want to rule out a quick rapid strengthening of one of these systems, because we've seen that in the past few years. But this is likely to be a rainmaker, so whether it reaches tropical storm strength or not isn't going to change too much with how much rain moves into portions of the lower Mississippi River Valley. So this will have to be watched closely for potential flooding, and if it's a little stronger than expected, we might have some gusty winds associated with it as well. With all the activity expected, those troughs moving through the central and eastern Corn Belt up through the plains, the Canadian Prairie, still looking, despite the heat risk in the long range, at a pretty friendly precipitation forecast over a wide area of the country. We'll have to watch some of the holes here. Keep an eye on this one here over Georgia and the Carolinas, just because, frankly, out in the long range, seeing a lack of precipitation in that corridor here. But even seeing that kind of almost average activity in the monsoon here, too, over the middle part of July with better precipitation. Very little precipitation chances out west. That's to be expected this time of year, but worth mentioning with some of those wildfires still burning, that they're lacking precipitation in the forecast. I do want to show you the AIFS forecast here. I'm going to take this well out into the forecast quickly because it doesn't change too much from the ECMWF proper that I showed you. But when I do get out to Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, strangely, the ridging that the AIFS had has been a little bit weaker than what the ECMWF has. And the reason for that, I think, is what we're seeing here. Despite the rather strong ridge here south of Alaska, west of British Columbia, it's not as amplified as the forecast I showed you earlier, which had that ridge pushing all the way up into Alaska. So this pattern here, a little bit less blocked, allowing this troughing to get more out into the central part of the country. This, again, through this corridor here, would be a very wet forecast. We'd certainly have some heat, some warm nights, but you'd have daytime thunderstorm chances as well, potentially severe over the middle part of the country. So there's some differences in the forecast going forward. If we do just look at the ECMWF, the precipitation anomalies over 10 days, again, corridor of good precipitation chances here, above average across the Canadian Prairie, at least the southern portions of it, along Montana into the plains, the northern plains, through the Midwest, into the eastern Corn Belt, over toward the mid-Atlantic. Of course, there's that potential tropical system we're keeping an eye on. But gosh, I mentioned Georgia and South Carolina. Some of the ridge kind of repeatedly building back in, kind of in this pattern Eric mentioned yesterday, how the ridge is kind of redoubling out of the east, not out of the west. And, if anything, our concern is that the Bermuda high has been a little bit too strong at times this year. It's shown the trajectories pushing moisture up in almost over here toward Texas, toward the north. And that's left some of these areas along the Atlantic coastline almost in too close a proximity to that dominating high pressure system, leaving some areas, going back and forth dry in this part of the country. The AIFS, it's always a little bit drier on these anomaly maps. We'll have to look into that. But again, shows that potential for these swaths of precipitation to come through the Midwest, potentially looking at a derecho at the middle part of next week. That potential is there. We'll have to keep a close eye on it. Look at the temperature forecast out. We're looking at the grid of temperatures. So here's the ECMWF ensemble on the top row over the next 15 days. This is the GFS ensemble, and then the AIFS on the southern row. There, I'm so used to looking at maps. The bottom row here, the southern part of the screen. And as you go into week 2, I'm looking closely at the middle part of the country, seeing some heat start to ramp up here. The Carolinas over toward Georgia, seeing that pick up in all 3 of these 5 to 10 day forecasts. So this is, we'll call the next work week. Still seeing some cooler anomalies hang on in the middle part of the country, less so in the AFS. But if you look out into the 3rd week now, the 2nd week, but the 3rd column, heat increasing in chance, at least from the AFS and the ECMWF ensemble. The GFS advertising less of it right now. It has performed pretty poorly in recent weeks, so I'm going to discount it a little bit in favor of the AFS or the NS again. So the heat risk returning as we get into the latter part of July, but precipitation, at least through the Midwest, the upper Midwest, and the eastern Corn Belt, appears to be continuing. So warmth, but storms through a wide area of the country. I want to jump back quickly and talk about the temperature conversation. These are the maximum temperatures here forecast for this morning. This is from the National Weather Service. You can see warmth here over the middle, kind of eastern portions of the country, save for some areas underneath some of those lingering showers and thunderstorms. We talked about the flood watches, the potential in these areas here. But 90s have returned to a wide area of the country. You can see the upper 80s here across Wisconsin and Michigan, 90s over toward the kind of mid-Atlantic New England area. We see with the influence of that troughing, the precipitation, the showers over the Dakotas, those overnight thunderstorms, Montana, high temperatures down today. That continues on Wednesday with that ridging trying to build into the eastern part of the country. But as that trough moves through, the front along with it drapes somewhere here, kind of near I-70, angled a little bit differently. And then finally by Friday, you can see cooler temperatures abounding in the central and eastern part of the country, save for maybe portions of the northwest. And then again, we talked about the Carolinas being an area for heat and potential dry risk over the next 10 days. Fairly seasonal as we go through the weekend, and then Monday you can see some of this ridging trying to get back. So I think next week, this forecast doesn't go out any further, but we're going to see those 90s pick up in a big way in this corridor here. Climate Prediction Center has latched onto this. So if we look at their temperature outlook for next work week, this is July 20th through the 24th, heat increasing over the middle part of the country here, cooler up in the northwest near the Canadian Prairie and California. The good news here is if I take this forecast out even further, again, increased heat over the middle part of the country, the west staying a little bit cooler, hopefully helping some of the wildfires get quelled there, but you can see heat increasing in a big way, anywhere from Indianapolis across through Wichita, down through the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and a wider area of above average contour even beyond that. I do want to jump back quickly while we're on the CPC forecast, show you the precipitation. Again, that corridor here, potential intense thunderstorm development still exists. I'm going to show the 8 to 14 day outlook. Again, fairly similar, but seeing a lull in some of that monsoon activity as we get near the end of July. Despite the wetter than average contours here, this is one area I'm going to be watching if the Bermuda high stays a little bit stronger. Some of the forecasts now getting out toward the end of July have this weakening, and that might assuage some of my concerns that this area flips back dry this year, but we have seen drought kind of reemerge here briefly at times. Look at the ECMWF. This is the ensemble of probabilities that we jump over 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And the reason I'm showing this is because it's very often, I'm going to show Friday when that trough's coming through the country. So let's do Friday afternoon here. And it's been a kind of familiar map where we haven't seen a lot of 90s get into this area of the country, even at times over into the eastern Corn Belt or the northern plains where, this time of year, it's very common to see 90 degree temperatures in this area here. Where we've seen them has been out west, all the way up near the Canadian border in Washington, Carolinas, and Georgia, as I mentioned, or over here in Texas or Oklahoma. But notice as I get out into next week, I'm going to do this quickly now, Sunday, Monday. This is now Tuesday evening. Notice those 90 degree, the probability of hitting 90 or higher is now up to about 50% or more on a contour that runs about here. So it's been pushing toward the north over that 7-day forecast. And even if I take it out into next week, Thursday, Friday further, and the chances that we get up to 90 creeping much further into the Midwest, further into the mid-Atlantic, and those heat chances, that heat risk coming along with it. Again, precipitation chances are high through this area still, even with some of that heat, but it's something we'll have to watch a bit closely. One reason that we've seen some of the, I think the ridging re-enter the forecast, at least for we'll call it the Midwest or even the Eastern U.S. At times this July, we have talked about the MJO living in phases 4, 5, and 6. And that has been a pattern that we've talked about for a while, that at least climatologically, looking to history as a guide. In July, if we go to like phase 4, phase 5, or even phase 6, we see more troughing over maybe the middle and eastern part of the country than not. But the MJO has been trying to move. In fact, I'm going to show you, here's that variable we look at for ascent in the atmosphere. This is from the ECMWF ensemble. Make the forecast a little bit bigger here. So it's over here in kind of phase 5. Now we'll call this maybe phase 5, getting toward phase 6. So I take this forecast out into the future here. Now Wednesday, Saturday, it's not July 20th. We see more ascent generally in maybe the middle Pacific area here in the eastern Pacific, some here in the western. Generally the ascent is here out into early next week, whereas when I started this forecast, if you had to point to one area where it's very clear that we have ascent, let's do July 15th. The center of that is here. It's not this kind of washed out center here. It's over here in kind of phases 4 and 5. And as we get out into what were phases 8 and 1 next week, what I was showing you, we jump back and use history as a guide for late July. We go to phase 1, for example. we do see that ridging show up right over the Great Lakes and kind of that area where we're watching it redouble out into next week. So it is consistent with what we've seen from some of the movement from the MJO. We'll have to continue to watch that for heat risks again in late July. One, I'll call maybe a wrinkle in that forecast. Eric mentioned this, I think last week, is how the atmosphere at times here this summer has kind of resembled a La Niña pattern. What I mean by that is if we just look at the sea surface temperatures and their difference from average across the globe rather than their difference from history, we still see this kind of cold tongue, if you will, this kind of like inverted or sideways V across the eastern Pacific, kind of south of Hawaii, west of South America. And we've seen the atmosphere at times exhibit kind of this increased trade winds. We've seen increased trade winds across the Atlantic. That has helped fuel some of the flooding events that we've seen this year. And La Niña tends to support MJO activity over here and less MJO activity, kind of where we're seeing it try to push into next week. And even the forecast next week shows the MJO kind of push out into the central and eastern Pacific, but then kind of push back near the end of July. So if it keeps returning back here, the same kind of historical analogs unfold in August, where if it stays over here, we tend to stay a little bit cooler, maybe a little bit wetter here over the middle part of the country, and we see less heat risk. Whereas if it comes, throttling through phases 8, 1, back toward 1, 2, 3 through the Indian Ocean, it tends to line up a little bit more with some heat and drought risk in August. So that is one thing I'm watching, whether this pattern flip toward heat is going to persist, 2-3 weeks suddenly into the early part of August, when there's kind of a wider area to be concerned with. Not seeing that right now, but it is something we'll have to keep an eye on as we arrive at that fork in the road in the forecast. I'll leave it there today. We'll keep an eye on that tropical system, and Eric will talk with you all tomorrow.